Welcome to Personality. I'm your host, Lori Rawlings from Lori Rawlings and Associates. And today, my guest is Kabri Lehrman Schmid from HENSEL PHELPS. Kabri is a project superintendent at HENSEL PHELPS, and over her 15-year career portfolio, she has demonstrated a depth of skill as a superintendent across all project phases on highly phased active campus projects totaling over $1.9 billion. She deliberately builds a culture of psychological safety on her job sites, which is what we're here to talk about today. And she's been recognized as one of Construction Business Owners 2019 Outstanding Women in Construction and received the Washington Women in Trades 2019 Workplace Leader Award. She's a champion for careers in construction management and the skilled trades. And Kabri is an excellent and experienced public speaker, co-chair of the Seattle Construction Suicide Prevention Task Force, and an AGC Culture of Care Steering Committee member, and a former director of the NAWIC Puget Sound board. So Kabri, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. We're going to be talking about psychological safety today in construction. And I'm wondering if you can start us out by telling us, what is psychological safety?
Absolutely. So psychological safety is a term that's become more familiar over the last 5 years in business, managerial development trainings, the technology sector, and it speaks to how people can interact with each other at work. And so somebody who feels they have psychological safety at work does not have fear of judgment or retribution when they share something or ask a question at their job or with their team. And so it's the concept of having safety to interact with other people and to be able to contribute your whole self, to be able to learn more and to be able to make change with your team around you.
That really resonates for me because a lot of the work I do is diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And I can see how important it is for people to feel psychologically safe, to be able to be their full selves in the workplace. And it's really important that people feel accepted and welcome and safe in their environment to be able to speak up about things that are perhaps problematic for them. So, can you elaborate a little bit about why psychological safety is so important on construction job sites in particular?
Absolutely. So in construction, we focus so much of our day, myself as a superintendent on large job sites, my planning is associated with keeping people safe. My planning is associated with creating production and putting work in place. If somebody is distracted from the task that they're performing or unable to ask for clarity about, let's say, safe practices, then they're not only putting themselves in danger, but their whole team is in danger. They're not only causing themselves to be less productive, but they're unable to interact with their team and make their team more productive. And so the recognized metrics of the construction industry, so safety, production, maybe retention or training of our people, it's enhanced by the ability for people to stay focused on the task that they're performing and not feel that they're distracted without resources for something that's outside of work, or to your point of diversity, equity, and inclusion, feels like a hazard at work.
You hit the nail on the head as far as I'm concerned. The not feeling psychologically safe in your workplace has the potential to create physical safety issues, which is why I think it's so important that we focus on this topic in particular and on diversity, equity, and inclusion in construction more generally, because people who experience harassment or discrimination in the workplace are not able to focus fully on what they're doing. And exactly what you said, that creates the possibility that they're going to develop that tunnel vision and be so focused on the attack they're feeling in the moment that they're not going to be focused on working as safely and productively as they can. And that affects everybody on the job site.
Absolutely. Can I give you an example maybe of that coming together? Part of what I do, especially as a superintendent for my full-time job, is really try to make this applicable to the actual technical responsibilities we have. Like, it's not something that's over on the side. If you were to have a morning job site meeting and your apprentices are in attendance, and you say to that apprentice who is maybe a minority woman who is only a year into their apprenticeship, you say, your job today is to go up on that scaffold and to paint that beam. If there is a fear of being judged within that team, because we know apprenticeships and apprentices have a long history and a challenging cultural stigma within the industry, if they feel that they are already judged as a minority woman within their team, there is no way they're going to say, I'm sorry, but I was never taught to use a fall protection harness to do that task. There's no ability to engage in that conversation. Nobody has asked for their input. They have told them to do a task. And so psychological safety would kind of break down two barriers in this case. One, it would demonstrate to their whole team that there is value in learning. There is value in teaching one another. That would be one way to create psychological safety. Pairing up people and saying to the veterans, I value all of the skills you have. I think you should go teach that person, and passing on that concept of like relationships with each other. And two, if you're creating a place that doesn't support that person being judged for their gender or their race, then you're creating a space where they're feeling the ability to raise their hand and ask a question. And so we encounter, examples like that all the time on the job sites where people don't feel that they have permission to ask questions to do their work better and more safely.
Absolutely. And, it affects not only women and people of color, although it affects them probably most of all, but apprentices in general, I think, have a real difficulty feeling psychologically safe because of the tradition we have in this industry of hazing apprentices as a way of initiating them into the construction industry. And I don't know that people really understand the true psychological and safety implications of that sort of behavior. What are your observations on that?
Sure. My immediate reaction is that we have a lot of historic cultural challenges in our industry that stigmatize different positions or different topics, one of them being apprenticeships, which is ironic because I would also say that one of the values and the strengths of our industry is pride in training, pride in work and passing on that information. And yet somehow there's also this stigma against, people need to figure it out for themselves. So to see people in positions where they are not empowered or valued to be able to learn and get better contributes to a negative perception about the industry, contributes to our inability to maintain and retain people throughout their career. And it doesn't support the ability of our team to work at its highest performance.
So, what are some things that we can do to build psychological safety?
I think that a lot of the steps that we can take to create better teams can be performed in our daily responsibilities. And so I'll lead with that only because it doesn't need to be a monetary side effort that you need to get funding for as a company or an outside training. It comes down to relationships and treating people like human beings, but doing it in a way that tells them you want their input. You value what they're bringing to the project. You're willing to teach and to hear what they have to teach. And so what that looks like is in a job site safety meeting, encouraging somebody on your crew to share a story, right? Making connections between two different trades that are going to need the same outcome to be financially successful. So speaking with one trade, speaking to another, learning what it is that they need to feel successful, and then bringing them both together and acknowledging each other's priorities as important, right? It's bridging the gap between what sometimes people butt heads about and recognizing that you understand what they need to leave feeling successful. The next step is providing new information at the job site level. We just spoke about stigmas in our industry. We're trying very hard and have been for the last few years as an industry to tackle topics of diversity and inclusion. We've also been starting to tackle topics of mental health within our industry. If you create relationships where people are valuing you and respect you for the information that you bring to them, for your technical responsibilities, you're providing them the information they ask for. They need an RFI, you go write an RFI, you come back to them with follow-up. I mean, these are simple things we have to do every day, but doing it with intention to build relationships where you then can bring new information to the table. And in the next toolbox talk, you share information about the alarming mental health statistics of our industry, and you provide resources that your healthcare already has for your crew that you've never actually shared with your team because people didn't talk about it in the past. You start to knock down those stigmas using the respect you've already gained within the relationships you build every day.
So they seem like simple things that you're talking about, but they're definitely not easy to implement, I would imagine. I mean, what are some of the barriers that just make it difficult to talk about these things in the first place? And how can we overcome some of those barriers and stigmas?
Sure. As a manager, first, it takes some self-responsibility to go learn about different topics. And we're really lucky. Over the last 3 to 4 years, there are many construction-specific resources for both diversity and inclusion topics that are in short formats, really executable at the job site level, all the way through mental health resources that are used to help people assess where they're at and knock down some of the stigmas of what it means to be in an industry where machoism is valued, where there's access to lethal means. Once you've educated yourself on some of the resources that exist, what type of healthcare do you have to offer your team? What are regional resources that you can provide information on within the break room? Then you start introducing some of those topics in conversation. The very first time I had small toolbox talks with, so I had a 300-person job site, and we broke them down into smaller crews or partial crews. I handed out information about suicide prevention, and we started talking about the statistics within the industry that make us the second highest rate of suicide in the US. And some people looked at their feet, and some people flipped the card awkwardly. And by the end of it, you'd already shattered the room by saying the word suicide out loud on a job site. People came up afterwards just thanking you. Because when you ask the question in a room, how many people here have known somebody in the industry who has died by suicide? Almost half of the hands go up every time, which is terrible. But all it takes is breaking that stigma and saying, this is an allowable topic on this job site. And as a manager of the job site, I have complete control over what topics can get introduced, which is pretty awesome. So not easy, but there are resources that we can immediately introduce as part of our wide variety of safety procedures or planning procedures.
I think we touched on this, but we don't have a tendency to give people who are promoted into management positions a lot of training on how to have conversations like this. And so I can imagine it's really uncomfortable and difficult for people who've never really had HR training or any kind of training on talking about topics as sensitive and vulnerable as suicide to feel comfortable even bringing up the subject. So do you have any piece of advice for a foreman or a GF who, wants to be able to talk about these things and make their crew feel safe, but doesn't really, know exactly where to start or may feel uncomfortable or worried about saying the wrong thing?
Absolutely. There are a variety of already prepared toolbox talks out there that at least give you a format and an understanding of a level of appropriateness on what you need to talk about. We're not asking people to take on the responsibility of somebody else's life. We're asking you to understand the resources that you have and to share them, which we do quite often at a technical level. The You mentioned earlier that I've worked as a co-chair for the Washington Suicide Prevention Task Force. This was a group of industry leaders in the Seattle area that came together in 2019 before the pandemic to discuss the alarming statistics of the industry with the goal of creating industry-specific resources. One of the initiatives that we worked on was centered around a Washington State House bill that provided a directive and funding to create an industry-specific training on men's mental health and construction suicide prevention. We created a 1-hour virtual training that includes video interactions between construction personnel. It is highly specific to our industry. It talks about the risk factors and the stigmas. It is a great place to learn how to approach and to interact with somebody that you feel might be struggling, or to identify whether somebody is struggling. I'm proud to say that in a month, this is going to be accessible to the entire industry through the University of Washington's Forefront Suicide Prevention Program. And so I can provide you some of the information on how to access that. But it is a very clear and straightforward way to start to learn how to have those conversations. There are additional written resources available online that allow you to learn how to engage in those conversations as well. But starting to talk about it is really the first and hardest step.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad to hear that that training exists, because it's so critical to get that information out to as many people as possible, because suicide is an epidemic in the construction industry. I mean, we've covered that topic in depth in a different episode of this podcast. I mean, the statistics are really alarming. And so I guess I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are some of the factors that make suicide such an overwhelming problem in the construction industry?
The risk factors for suicide are usually attributed to the type of work that we do, whether it's isolated or hard physical labor. We have access to high places or lethal means. In and of itself, the work we do, I see as fairly neutral. What we can control are some of the consequences of that work. I, as a superintendent, have the complete ability whether or not to schedule the same person on night shift for a year in a row. I have the ability to learn enough about my people to understand if I'm taking them away from a new child. We have the ability to monitor for chronic pain, and we have the ability, you touched on this earlier, and it is so essential to really changing how we perform our work, is properly training our field management into leadership and responsibility roles, because they've probably historically been chosen to be a foreman because of how many lineal feet of wall track they put in last year. We do not have a great track record, and we don't have great resources for training our field management into roles of responsibilities. And it's a ton of responsibility. We are production driven, action oriented. We can manage against the consequences. But the stigmas that we've been talking about that exist, this is where the psychological safety comes in. How do we start to knock down the machoism that prevents people from talking about feelings? How do we make sure that we're willing to have a conversation about gun safety, because we have a strong gun culture in our industry? There are steps we can take that the statistics show us for suicide prevention, that we can share information about how to have better gun safety within a home that prevents suicide. If we can start to have conversations that allow people to ask for resources because they feel comfortable not only providing the resources as a manager, but asking for them within your team, if we can open up that channel of communication by creating psychological safety, then we can start knocking down those the consequences to the work that we do that create hazards for our people mentally and physically.
The macho culture is something that you've mentioned a lot, and I see that as being a factor not only for suicide, but also for harassment and discrimination, and just a wide variety of behaviors that take away from the work and working productively and safely. And so I guess I'm wondering, I mean, when you introduce that topic of trying to sort of push back on the macho culture, how is that received on job sites? I mean, do you get a lot of blowback on that, or are people sort of generally accepting of recognizing that that's a problem and that it needs to change?
I think that when I talk about it in this context as a cultural problem within the industry, I also make sure to recognize it as part of the value system within our industry that can have positive outcomes. What I mean by that is, we mentioned earlier how there is a value within the construction industry for training or for learning new skills. There are values for pride in work, right? There are values for family. And if you can turn around the machoism into providing for family, if you can turn it into doing great work and feeling proud of it, or being part of creating a new generation of skilled tradespeople, that's how you tap into the positives. Machoism in and of itself can propel positive outcomes if you're shutting down and setting clear expectations against sexism, racism, homophobia, and transphobia. If you're willing to tackle some of those topics and say, these things aren't acceptable. Another practical tactic is, everybody has too many slides in their job site orientation. Well, so do I. I have a few about suicide prevention and resources, and I have a few about the job site expectations for behavior. It's clear from the time you get on site. In practice, knocking out the negative outcomes of machoism that create people unwilling to listen to each other comes through just the daily relationship building and demonstrating that I care about what they care about. I care about what other people need to be successful. And if you can create that respect that the whole industry functions on, right? The tenure and respect and the understanding that you have a skill set that contributes to what they need, then you're creating the opportunity to have conversations at a more honest level. And you start taking out the need for, pomp and circumstance. You just start talking about what it is you actually need and what we can provide each other to get there.
Do you have any success stories that you can share with us about how creating a culture of psychological safety has improved the environment and the outcome on a job site?
Oh, goodness. I feel like my last 3 major projects are success stories, and it's really been the recognition during and afterwards of how well the teams function together. A good example would be, I was on night shift on and off for 3 years at an airport. I was working critical path work at night, and I was working a separate project with high-end finishes during the day. And so that was a stretch on me, and I know now not to do it to other people. But I used to get questioned by my management in the morning, every morning, what's going on with the critical path work at night? How are we protecting passengers? And I would always come and say, like, this is the plan, this is what we're doing. Did you know that so-and-so's personal life, X, Y, and Z? And I would often get the response, why do you care about all their drama? And my response was, I don't see it as drama. I see it as, I understand exactly what they are struggling with that day. We have an honest conversation about that. They feel okay to share it, that they don't need to silo it away and be distracted by it during work. We talk together and we make a plan for when things change. There's no hiding of problems. And we're the most productive team on the project. That is why this project was successful, was because we had an open communication. Once you have that open communication, this is a great success story. I said I went through and I had conversations with all my crews about suicide prevention. On night shift, I sat down with my drywaller crew that was doing temporary partitions around the public, throughout the night. And I shared the statistics and I shared a toolbox talk. The foreman stopped work for an extra half hour during their lunch break to share his own struggle with depression and suicide. This is just a general crew that felt comfortable enough to be able to share that and share it in my presence because we had the same goals of being successful for the job site.
That's really amazing and so important for somebody in a leadership position like that to model that it's okay to be depressed, to struggle with depression, and okay to share that knowledge with other people. And it's really impressive that you were able to get him to feel comfortable opening up and sharing that story with his teammates. How do you go about creating an environment where people feel that level of trust to be able to share information like that is really uncomfortable to share?
You hit on modeling the behavior. I feel it's really important to expect what you give to the team. And so I'll find appropriate times to interject something about my thought perspective on how that crane is going to be assembled, to ask questions and acknowledge somebody else's expertise, to make sure that they understand I'm interested in what they have to say so that there's an actual conversation. I'm setting up a new project right now, and I walked into my deep foundation and shoring general foreman's office, and this is the first time we had met, and the first thing he said was, "I'm not sure if I should tell you, but I think now I will. So I have a different plan than your plan, and I think I should tell you about it." And I'm like, "Great." It's like, okay. And he went through his plan, and I said, "So you're telling me that you feel it's more important to have a workflow through your shoring than through your deep foundations?" And he's like, "Yes, exactly." He's like, "I think it's better for the excavating team. I think it's better for the demo contractor." I'm like, "That's great. I was assuming something else." And he's like, "What do you mean that's great?" I'm like, "I'm not the expert of your trade." And he was floored. This is a gentleman who is senior in his position, has been doing this for twice as long as I have, but just engaging people in conversation where you want to hear what they have to say goes a really long way.
It's really amazing, isn't it? It comes down to communication and just the willingness to listen. And I think it's really hard. So I'm curious, how did you become interested in the concept of psychological safety?
That's a great question. Psychological safety, when I learned about it, probably through a podcast or a TED Talk from Amy Edmondson, who really coined the term. When I first heard about it, it really felt like an appropriate umbrella for my management style, which is very facilitating. It felt really appropriate for my interest in my own personal experience as a 5-foot, half-inch female superintendent in the construction industry who wants to bring along more underrepresented individuals into the industry. And so I had been doing a lot of work with workforce development initiatives focused on getting more individuals into the industry. It felt like it captured my passion for discussing the topics of mental health, especially when COVID hit and construction kept going. The silver lining was it destroyed the line between personal and professional life that we had held so strongly to for so long. We started to have to recognize that people had to go home to help their kids who were out of school. We started to have to be more flexible, but work went on. We kept working. And so when I heard about psychological safety, it felt like a really important way to capture how important relationships were to those valuable metrics of our industry: the production, the physical safety, the retention, and the seeking out of skilled people. It just fits so nicely. And so it's a topic that's starting to get overused in some circles. And it's a topic that other areas of the country just haven't been exposed to. And that's really, really great because so many people are coming at the same topics: mental health, DEI, safety, from their different silos within the industry. And we're starting to bridge all of those different silos with topics that affect our people, from HR, from safety, from legal, from project management.
And that makes so much sense because really what's fundamentally at the core of all of those different things is recognizing people as individuals and treating them as human beings and making them feel comfortable to be themselves in the workplace. I think that's at the core of psychological safety. It's at the core of an inclusive workplace. It's at the core of so many things. And so I can see why there's synergy. I don't really like that word, but there's so many synergies between these different areas because it really comes down to making a culture shift so that we're focusing on our people as people and not just commodities.
Yeah, it's letting people know not only that they're valued and that they will be included. So that's like the inclusion and diversity element of it. It's giving them the recognition that they have the power to impact their experience. It's not just saying, here's a great place for you to feel good. It's that if you don't feel good, you can ask a question. If you think there's a better way, let's talk about it. If you need something, that's why I'm here as your management, which also means you have to train your management to be there for people.
Yeah, and exactly. Once people feel comfortable and empowered to share that there might be a better way of doing something, that you shared a great example of how that benefits the entire project and the entire team and the entire company. Because there might be a better way to do things that people just didn't feel comfortable talking about before they realized that your team was a safe place to share ideas and potential disagreements. Let's talk a little bit about your background in the construction industry. I mean, how did you come to the construction industry and what attracted you to it in the first place?
So I was a civil engineering student in college. I knew nothing about the construction industry. And I had an internship one summer at the Pentagon renovation. And my job was with the owner overseeing the general contractor, which was HENSEL PHELPS, the company I've now worked for over 15 years. And what I saw in that team was excitement about problem solving and working together to figure out the best solution. That happened to be like a design build structured project. And so very early on, I had an understanding of the expectation of teaming and of having to work together to find value. But being able to conduct work face to face and to go walk over and talk about something very specifically and logistically, I just loved it. And so I had a few internships within the industry, and then I joined on full time. And what I've found, even though I don't have a background in the trades, I wish I would have known about that option in my younger years, is that yeah, and it depends on where you are in the country, which region. Sometimes that's completely normal. There's superintendents with all different backgrounds. Where I am right now, it is very atypical to be a superintendent without a trades background. And so that adds another level of building relationships and demonstrating that I'm here to listen to your experience and to learn from it and to make sure that, we're understanding what we can each bring to the success of this project. And so every time I feel that there's like a project cultural win, I feel extra good about it because, I've gotten over that hump of being a woman, of, having a non-trades background. And yet we're creating change for the whole industry beyond the job site.
As you were talking about your collaborative work style, I was thinking it's probably because she's a woman, that she has that more sort of traditionally collaborative work style than we tend to see in the field for sure. Do you think, is there something to that? Do you think because of your background and the fact that you're kind of an outsider and you're a woman in this industry, that that's something that is an asset in terms of the way you interact with your team?
It is an asset. And I think when I have spoken over the last 15 years of my career to internal women's groups or in a leadership position to other women, I've always described being a woman as an asset because your voice is already heard differently. Might as well say something different. But if you're proving yourself to be someone who's there to help provide the information, to follow up, to help to lead, to help to communicate their needs for the other people within the field, you'll get the respect, you'll get the knowledge by asking the questions. I definitely think that it's a socialization defense mechanism as well as an asset. Coming into the industry without a strong background, it was very clear to me from the beginning that the respect is owed to those in the field, and I need to do what I can to learn from them. And so you ask more questions and you ask them humbly, and you create relationships so that you're likable. So there's definitely a tie to being a woman. I think that addressing the issue of machoism could be more difficult for somebody who looks like the majority, to be honest. But that's where the power comes in. If a white male within the construction industry, statistically the majority, starts changing the conversation and they already have that level of respect, and rapport within their giant network, that's change. That makes so much change because you're normalizing a new conversation and saying, this is permissible. This is allowed on the job site, and I'm here to support you.
And is that something you do? Do you sort of recruit men who have positions of influence or just sort of natural influence within their circles to help you spread the message about psychological safety?
I do, in a few different ways. One, I'm part of an amazing foreman basic training program that takes not only new foremen, but experienced foremen and general foremen, and runs them through a training that is rather unique for the industry. It covers some technical abilities from Bluebeam and daily reports in a very engaging and successful way, but also addresses issues of diversity and inclusion and how to be a good leader in ways that they have not seen before. And being part of a mentorship group for that, and being able to help walk through their graduation presentations, I'm seeing reflected in their excitement and enthusiasm the ability to impact their future job sites and their teams. And so it's starting to click within the trainings we're providing. In my own company, it's continuing to talk about what I'm doing on my projects with others, not just remaining siloed as a superintendent on my projects, but making sure I'm connecting with the other superintendents and project managers throughout my region, throughout my company. And then when I get asked to be on a panel, my first question now is, who else is on the panel? Because if it's mostly women, I decline and say, I have somebody else. And I encourage one of my other superintendents or foremen to take that role from me, because they've found the same success. They're just not challenged or motivated to talk about it until you give a little nudge.
That's awesome. Because you're right. I think it's really important to have different perspectives coming to the table, but it's also important to have people who look like the majority of the people who work in the field promoting this message, and that, this isn't just a women's issue or an issue for people of color or the LGBTQ community or people who are underrepresented. This is something that benefits everybody because it's something that affects everybody. And so it's really important to have ambassadors from every demographic, but particularly that core demographic of white men who predominate in the industry and really set the tone. So that's really smart. Wonderful. Well, this has been really amazing. I'm just wondering if there's anything else that you would like our audience to know about psychological safety or about resources that exist to help them start building a culture of psychological safety within their organizations.
Resources exist right now to be able to go out and start having new conversations. So I think that I would leave people with an understanding that every single person can impact the team around them with how they engage with each other and the topics that they bring to the table. This does not need to be an outside or secondary effort to be able to bring in a new program or a new initiative. It doesn't need a marketing effort behind it. It's using the resources you already have in relationships and in tools and in safety procedures and starting to think about them in a new way. It's sitting down for your scheduling updates with your foreman and talking to them in a different way and asking them for their input and just listening. So I'd leave you with, go find some resources. We'll put some in the show notes. And two, make sure that when you're doing your daily technical responsibilities, you understand the impact that you can make.
Well, thank you, Kabri, for the work you're doing and for taking time to join us today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.